Mr. Speaker.
Damian Green.
Mr. Speaker, I've been asked to reply on behalf of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, who's abroad in the Middle East, furthering our interests in a region that's fundamental to our national security and prosperity. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in offering our warmest congratulations to His Royal Highness Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, and in wishing them every happiness in the future. Today also marks the 100th anniversary of the creation of the RAF. The whole House will want to express our thanks for a century of service to this country.
The First Secretary's congratulations to Prince Harry on his engagement. Thanks to the outstanding efforts by the Labour Council in North East Lincolnshire, the Government has included the Greater Grimsby project in its industrial strategy document. But we need more than a byline in a glossy magazine to make its potential a reality. Will the First Secretary say when we can expect his government to put its money where its mouth is so that we can get going?
I think beneath this I can welcome the fact that the Honourable Lady is welcoming the industrial strategy, as she should do. It will be good for Grimsby, it will be good for many communities around this country, particularly those who may feel that in the past they have been left behind. And I'm happy to assure her that the industrial strategy will come with money attached, as she will have heard in my right honourable friend the Chancellor's budget.
Mr. Simon Clarke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Making a success of the South Tees Mayoral Development Corporation is vital for Teesside, and I was delighted to welcome the Prime Minister to my constituency this summer. Will he join me in recognising the scale of the opportunity the MDC represents, agree it offers a chance to redefine Teesside to the world, and commit that the new money awarded in the budget is only the start of the process of delivering on its huge potential to change?
The Secretary.
I can see my honourable friend is getting the hang of questions already. And I'm happy to assure him that we are committed to working with him and indeed the Tees Valley Mayor, Ben Houchen, who is doing so much to help develop the area. We want to support him and the South Tees Development Corporation with the work they're doing on the long-term regeneration of the South Tees area. As he says, the Chancellor announced £123 million of new funding in the budget because we recognise the significant economic opportunities in that area.
Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me first join the Secretary of State in congratulating the RAF on its anniversary and congratulating Prince Harry and Meghan Markle on their engagement. That's one Anglo-American couple we on this side will be delighted to see holding hands. I'm sure that Prince Harry, the patron of Rugby Football League, will be joining all of us in supporting the England team in the World Cup final on Saturday. And I, for one, will of course be waving my St George's flag. On a much sadder note, I'm sure the whole House will join me in sending our thoughts to all those killed and injured in Friday's horrific attack on the mosque in North Sinai. It is a bitter reminder that the vast majority of the victims of jihadi terror are Muslims. Before I get on with my questions, Mr. Speaker, can I ask the First Secretary a simple point of principle? Is he happy to be held to the same standards in government that he required of others whilst he was in opposition?
The Secretary.
Yes, I am. I think all ministers should respect and obey the ministerial code, and I absolutely think that that's a very important part of confidence in public life. Can I also echo her thoughts about the terrible events in Sinai, and also say that she may find it difficult to wave the St George's flag, but I will be doing so for the English Rugby League team. As a Welsh rugby fan, I may find it even more difficult than her, but I will be doing so as well.
Emily Thornberry.
Mr. Speaker, the First Secretary looked rather perturbed at my line of questioning, but he doesn't need to worry. I really am not going there. I merely wondered if he remembered the question he asked at Prime Minister's Questions almost 17 years ago, when John Prescott stood in for Tony Blair, and whether he could answer the same question today. So what's the question? The question was this: what percentage of new nurses recruited in the past 12 months are now working full-time?
Secretary.
I can't remember.
What was the answer there?
I can't remember asking the question then, and I'd love to know what the then Deputy Prime Minister answered then. What I'm happy to assure the Right Honourable Lady is that we have more nurses, more midwives, more doctors working in the health service now. The health service is performing more operations now, certainly than it was 17 years ago. And in particular, in the budget last week, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, was able to announce more than £6 billion extra on health spending, which will make the health service even stronger in the future than it is now.
Emily Thornberry.
I thank him for that response, but since he failed to answer my original question, I'll do it for him. According to the government's latest figures, more than 40% of newly recruited nurses are leaving full-time employment within their first year. And it is not just the new recruits that are quitting. The overall number of NHS nurses and health visitors is down by 1,500 this year. And the numbers are now lower than when this government came into office. So, why does the First Secretary think that so many nurses are leaving?
So he was wrong.
There are, as I say, more operations being done, more nurses, more doctors, more midwives. The health service is expanding. We have got 14,900 more doctors, 1,500 more medical school places each year. And we've got 10,000 more nurses on our wards, and we've announced an increase of more than 5,000 extra nurse training places every year. We are, of course, we have said, in addition, the Chancellor said in his budget that we would commit to make sure that the nurses' pay increase, the Action for Change status, Agenda for Change, the Agenda for Change staffing covered would not come out of other health spending. So nurses can be reassured that this government will continue to support them both in pay and in terms of numbers, and that is why our health service in England is getting better. If she wants to look at a health service where things are getting worse, she can look to the Labour government in Wales. And she doesn't need to take it from me, she can take it from the public, because public satisfaction with the NHS in Wales is lower than it is in England. That's the effect of Labour government on healthcare.
I hate to break it to him, but there are more nurses in the NHS than just those who are working in emergency and acute wards, including district nurses. They have halved under the Tories. And guess who picks up the slack if nurses aren't there? It's nurses in emergency and acute care. But the question I asked, Mr. Speaker, is why so many nurses are leaving the vocation they love. Now, according to the RCN, the top 4 reasons are excess workload, staff shortages, low pay, and worries about patient care. And according to the government's own figures, the number of nurses quitting because of worries about their finances or their health has doubled since the Tories first froze their pay. So let's get on to the question, with the question that was asked by John Prescott 17 years ago. He said that nurses at his local hospital were warning, and I quote him again, staff shortages are putting patients' lives at risk. So can he tell me, what are those same nurses telling the First Secretary today?
What I can tell you is that since 17 years ago, and it's interesting that 17 years ago there were still significant numbers of years of Labour government ahead with all these pressures she's just exposed to us under the Labour government. Since 17 years ago, there are significant more nurses in post, and I didn't quite understand her point about wards, because she seemed to go on and off the wards, but we know that we've got 10,000 more nurses on our wards where where people want to see them. And also, if she's interested in nurses' pay, of course, I hope she will find it in herself to welcome the tax cuts that were announced in the budget, the increase in the personal allowances that will help nurses just as they will help workers across both the public and private sector. This is good news for nurses. It was a budget that was not just good for the health service, but specifically good for the nursing profession. As I say, I hope she can bring herself to welcome that.
Emily Thornberry.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I noticed that he didn't want to talk about patient care at his local hospital. Could the reason be that his local A&E, according to the board's most recent minutes, and I quote, have severe staff shortages in medical and nursing care, means patient safety is being put at risk, and the only option to tackle those shortages is to cancel outpatient clinics.
Oh!
And it gets worse. And it gets worse. At a public meeting tomorrow, there is going to be a public meeting tomorrow to consider closing his local A&E for good. In other words, all the things that the First Secretary has been denying. What are you doing to our NHS? It is happening on your own doorstep. Isn't it about time that the First Secretary got a grip?
I am entirely innocent in this matter. First Secretary.
The Right Honourable Lady's grasp of the facts is pretty shaky. The meeting tomorrow in my constituency is about the strategic transformation plan. I am happy to assure her that I am entirely in favour of option 1 of that strategic transformation plan, which suggests not just leaving A&E services in the hospital in my constituency, but actually expanding specialist services there. I would strongly suggest she doesn't try to think she knows more about what's going on in my constituency than I do.
I suspect that neither the nation nor his own constituents will have taken any reassurances from that answer. But really, Mr. Speaker, we have an NHS which is in the grip of a chronic funding and staffing crisis. GPs are quitting in record numbers, junior doctors are running A&Es without supervision, our nurses are at breaking point, and all this is before the winter crisis that is coming. So, Mr. Speaker, let me finally ask the First Secretary, what does it say about the government's priorities that last week's budget could only find £350 million to help the cash-strapped stretched to the limit NHS cope with the winter fuel crisis? Only £350 million to cope with the winter crisis, and was able to find 11 times that amount to spend on a no-deal Brexit. Isn't that the very definition of a government fiddling away whilst the rest of the country burns?
The Right Honourable Lady is determined to talk the NHS down. It's a Conservative government which is increasing funding on the NHS so it remains the best health service in the world, as the Independent Commonwealth Fund has repeated for the second year in a row. It's this party which promised and delivered more money for the NHS in 2010, 2015 and in last week's budget, where my right honourable friend the Chancellor promised £6.3 billion extra for the NHS. More patients treated, more operations carried out by more doctors and more nurses. And when she says at the end that the government is wasting £3 billion on preparing for Brexit, we now know that the Labour Party doesn't think it's worth preparing for Brexit. They do though think it's worth preparing for a run on the pound. That's all you need to know about Labour.
Mr. Speaker, this week, one of Labour's last 2 remaining councillors in Boston crossed the floor to join the Conservative Party. And he said he didn't want to see this country go back to 1973. Will the First Secretary join me in welcoming this new member to the Conservative Party, and will he agree with me that an open, optimistic Britain deserves better than reheated Marxism and Labour's bankrupt economy?
I am very happy to agree with my honourable friend and indeed with the wisdom of the Labour councillor who has joined the Conservative Party. Quite right that what we see from the party opposite is that they would lose control of public finances, hike taxes to their highest ever peacetime level, and calls business, the Shadow Chancellor, new quote I've discovered from the Shadow Chancellor, calls business the enemy. That's what the modern Labour Party is about. I would finally point out to the local councillor, he may just have moved in anticipation, because I understand that moderate councillors are being deselected by the hard left.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the First Secretary in congratulating Prince Harry and Meghan on their engagement and wish them a long life and happiness together? And if I may, can I also welcome the moderator of the Church of Scotland, the Reverend Derek Browning, who is with us in the gallery today. Mr. Speaker, can the First Secretary of State tell the House how much money the UK government has received from arms sales from Saudi Arabia since the war with Yemen began?
Secretary.
I'm afraid I don't have the figure to hand, but I do urge the honourable gentleman to recognise the fact, first of all, that our defence industry is an extremely important creator of jobs and prosperity in Scotland as well as in other parts of the country, and that we have, because I'm obviously aware of the very terrible situation in Yemen at the moment, but this country has one of the most rigorous and robust defence sales regimes in the world. It was recognised in a court case last July, and we are absolutely determined to continue the most rigorous and robust system in place, because that's the right thing to do, both for our prosperity and to ensure we keep proper control on arms sales.
Well, that's a long time to be able not to answer the question, but I'll tell the First Secretary. The UK government has received £4.6 billion in selling arms to Saudi Arabia since the war in Yemen began. A war which has created a devastating humanitarian crisis. Yemen is now on the brink of famine, and UNICEF has said that 150,000 children will die by the end of this year. Doesn't the First Secretary agree that the best thing that the Prime Minister can do with our meetings today is follow the example of the Netherlands and suspend licences for arms sales to Saudi Arabia to stop killing children?
Secretary.
I should correct something the right honourable gentleman said, that the government received money. It will be the companies that receive the money, and therefore their workers. So he can take that position if he wants. It's I know the Labour Party's position as well, but that would certainly entail significant job losses. Now, what is very, very important is not only that we have the robust regime which I talked about, but that absolutely we continue the humanitarian efforts that we make to try and alleviate the terrible conditions in Yemen. We are the fourth largest humanitarian donor to Yemen and the second largest to the UN appeal. And I would also remind him that the involvement of the Saudis in this conflict came at a request of the legitimate government of Yemen and has United Nations Security Council backing. That's why we support it. This is a conflict supported by the UN Security Council, and I would hope that the right honourable gentleman will have some respect for the Security Council.
Rebecca Powell.
Speaker, this government's ambition to build more homes is welcome, especially amongst those struggling to get on the housing ladder. And Taunton Deane is playing its part, and with its garden town status, we must have homes that are good places to live, energy efficient, sustainable drainage, green spaces. Mr. Speaker, maybe even where we have showers where people don't use microbeads in their showers. But we must have the right roads in these developments. development, and would my right honourable friend agree that the Housing Infrastructure Fund is key to unlocking funds for vital roads like the Spine Road through Taunton and Stapleburn?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I know what a stout champion she is of the people of Taunton Deane. And she's quite right about the Housing Infrastructure Fund as well. We need more homes, but absolutely we need the infrastructure to back them up. That's why the Chancellor doubled the Housing Infrastructure Fund in the budget.
Duffield!
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the First Secretary of State will know, being my near neighbour in Kent, as a result of underfunding, the Conservative County Council has run out of cash and is cutting the funding of buses in Kent by 70%. Four hospital buses, 14 school buses and over 100 other routes are to be cut. Thousands of pensioners, especially those in rural areas, are to be trapped at home. Does the Right Honourable Member for Ashford really support such cuts?
Secretary.
I do not recognise the characterisation of Kent County Council's position, which my constituency neighbour has expressed. All local authorities, as all parts of the public sector, have to live within their means, because we have to continue paying down the deficit that was run up by the previous Labour government. Kent County Council is an extremely good county council which does many great things both in transport and other fields for the people of Kent, and will continue to do so.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Would my right honourable friend agree that for decades now, the richer member states in the European Union have made large contributions to the budget of the EU because the macroeconomic benefits of belonging to the large free trade area of the single market make it a bargain to pay that share of the cost? Should we not therefore welcome the rumours we have today in the press of a possible imminent settlement of the method of calculating future contributions, so that it may now enable us to get on with the serious negotiations about how we retain the maximum future access to all those benefits of that free trade?
Well,
Secretary.
My right honourable friend has been around long enough to know not necessarily to read, to believe everything he reads in the newspapers, and it would clearly be wrong for me to go into figures now. But he is absolutely right that what we are about, and what my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, is about, is making sure we get the best possible deal at this stage of the process so that we can move on to the trade talks. And Britain, as a country that meets its international obligations, of course, will, as it exits the European Union, meet the obligations and have all the rights that we have in that process, so that we can maintain a deep and special partnership with the other 27 members of the European Union as we move forward in friendship and cooperation after we've left the European.
Being believed, reliving trauma, fear of publicity, a culture of denial, some of the reasons why very many women are reluctant to report rape, assault and sexual harassment. Does he agree with me that Government and Parliament need to lead by example, and will he, on behalf of Government, apologise to the victims who Parliament and Government have been letting down?
I absolutely agree that both this place as an institution and all of the political parties need to improve complaints procedures and other aspects of the culture of politics to make sure that young men or young women who are interested in politics do not in any way feel deterred from playing an active role in it. And there is a place for everyone in this House, on all sides and in all parties, and indeed the House authorities themselves, of making sure that this is the best possible working environment for young people to come into.
Nadine Dorries.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr Speaker, many mothers in this chamber know how hard childbirth can be, but we would never use that knowledge in a veiled threat against a journalist when being questioned in the way the Honourable Member for Hampstead and Kilburn did when questioned by a Channel 4 journalist recently. As I assume the First Secretary is not pregnant, would he please complete the work that journalist tried and ask the Honourable Member for Hampstead and Kilburn to use her influence with her aunt, who is the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, whose regime is responsible for the kidnapping of Ahmed bin Hussein, and ask for his release?
Very good question.
First Secretary replies, I'm sure the Honourable Lady, the Member for Mid-Bedford, I'm sure the Honourable Member for Mid-Bedfordshire notified the Honourable Lady of an intention to refer to her in this question.
No, she didn't. No, she didn't.
You didn't? Well, that was disorderly. Sorry, that was disorderly. Order. Nevertheless, the question has been asked. Nevertheless, perfectly proper for the First Secretary briefly to reply.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you and the House will be aware I can only speak on behalf of the government, and I can assure my honourable friend that Bangladesh remains an important human rights priority area for the Foreign Office, and that we continue to raise allegations of enforced disappearances at all levels of the government of Bangladesh, and I think I should stop there.
Steve McCabe.
Mr. Speaker, at the present rate of progress, it will take the three officials at the First Secretary's old department more than 70 years to investigate the claims of around 4,500 WASPI women deprived of their state pension. Now, I know this government's slow, but isn't that adding insult to injury?
The Secretary.
The honourable gentleman will be aware that the government committed a sum of more than £1 billion to make sure that no one's pension would be delayed more than 18 months from the original period. And he also, I'm sure, as a reasonable man, recognises that with increasing longevity, it is inevitable that the pension age will rise. That is what this government is doing. And by next year, pension inequality will have been removed. We will hit 65 for both sexes in next year, and that means that we will then have an equal pension system.
James Gray.
The Royal Air Force is unique amongst the three services in having been established by an Act of Parliament which achieved royal assent 100 years ago today. Will my right honourable friend find time in his busy diary to join me and members of both houses and staff throughout the Palace in celebrating the magnificent service the RAF have given to this nation over that 100 years, in a parade, a unique parade in the atrium of Portcullis House this evening at 7:30 by the Queen's Colour Squadron?
Well, I've already mentioned the centenary today, and my honourable friend is extremely right, not just to bring it up again. We cannot pay high enough tribute to the men and women of the RAF for a century of service that will go on for a long time into the future as well. And I'm glad he's managed to get an advert in for the parade this evening at Portcullis House.
Grady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The United Kingdom has lost its seat on the International Court of Justice. EU agencies are pulling out of London, and there'll be no more European capitals of culture in the United Kingdom. Is the sun setting on Empire 2.0 before it's even begun?
The Secretary.
I think the honourable gentleman it's not surprising, really, that EU institutions are not going to be in a state that's not a member of the EU. That can't come as a surprise to the honourable gentleman. On the capitals of culture, I rather agree with him. I think it's extremely disappointing that after they'd let British cities ask, including I know some in Scotland, asking to apply to be part of the process, the Commission decided that they couldn't. We are in urgent talks with the Commission about that, and in particular we're making sure that all those cities who applied can continue with their cultural development, because cultural development has been shown to be an extremely good basis for the regeneration of cities and towns across the United Kingdom.
Amanda Milling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Saturday I'll be announcing the winners of my annual local shop competition as part of Small Business Saturday. So will my right honourable honourable friend wish all Cannock Chase retailers the best of luck and also wish those winners congratulations.
I'm very happy to share my honourable friend's congratulations for her retailers. I suspect many members will be celebrating Small Business Saturday this weekend. It's become an extremely important part of the calendar. Supporting small business is absolutely at the heart of this government's economic strategy, and we should all take every opportunity to celebrate the hugely important work they do in innovation, in entrepreneurship and in serving the people.
Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, we see shocking new figures that child knife deaths are nearing a 40-year high. 5 months ago, the Prime Minister in this place promised action, but she has failed to deliver. Nothing in the budget on policing and nothing meaningful to tackle the causes as well as the crime. It's clear we need intervention now and not just from the Home Office. Funding youth workers in major trauma centres is proven to get young people out of the cycle of violence, and it would cost £6 million a year to fund. Will the First Secretary, in his role, establish a cross-government programme of action to come good on the Prime Minister's promise?
First Secretary.
I'm sure the Honourable Lady is aware that actually the stance on knife crime that this government is taking is tougher than ever. We've made punishment against repeat offenders stronger. We've banned cautions for the most serious offences, and there is now a very clear message. If you carry knives in public, you are more likely than ever to go to prison. And the latest figures show that 42% of adult offenders were given an immediate custodial sentence, the highest rate in nearly a decade. So I hope that she can be reassured that actually this government is being tougher on knife crime than any previous government.
Nadeem Zahawi.
Speaker, does the First Secretary agree with me that we don't need to break into the computer or the iPad of the member for Hayes and Harlington to work out that £500 billion that he wants to borrow will attract £7.5 billion of interest payments every year?
Well, the one difficulty with that otherwise ingenious question is that it bears no relation to government policy, for which the right honourable gentleman is responsible, but rather to that of the Shadow Chancellor, for which he isn't. Wayne David.
Mr. Speaker, Sharon Jones is a constituent who had a malignant brain tumour removed some 20 years ago. This left her with excruciating headaches and severe pain in her neck and shoulders. Sharon has been in receipt of ESA, and the Department for Work and Pensions accepts that Sharon is not fit for work, and yet she has now been placed in the work-related activity group and her benefit has been reduced. Will the First Secretary justify this to Sharon?
Wow.
First Secretary.
Well, obviously, there will clearly be individual issues in this case, which I can't be aware of. I'm sure my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, would be very happy to look at this individual case to see if something needs to be done for Sharon.
John Stevenson.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the announcement of a Borderlands growth deal. This is positive news for the border area. But can the First Secretary assure me that this initiative will receive sufficient resource to ensure its success?
The Secretary.
I share my honourable friend's enthusiasm for the Borderlands Growth Initiative. I've seen the many benefits of city deals and growth deals around all parts of the United Kingdom since I became First Secretary. And I think the Borderlands Growth Initiative is particularly important because it will show the mutual prosperity between his part of the north of England and the southern part of Scotland. And all I can say is that since my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, is actually a constituency MP in the southern part of Scotland, I know that this deal will get particularly strict attention inside the Cabinet.
Tommy Shepherd.
Does the First Secretary agree with the Lord Speaker's Committee that the House of Lords should be reduced to 600 and that the term should be limited to 15 years? And does he not feel the slightest sense of embarrassment that the crisis of credibility of the undemocratic upper chamber has become so acute that its members are themselves begging for reform whilst the elected government refuses to act?
Yes, I think when the honourable gentleman speaks on behalf of all members of the House of Lords in terms of begging for reform, he may not necessarily absolutely be representing the entire range of views in another place, but I'm happy to assure him that the government is looking very carefully at the proposal of the Burns Committee, and we will, of course, respond in due course.
Damian Collins.
Speaker. Could my honourable friend and neighbour say what action the government is proposing to take against Russian-backed agencies spreading fake news and disinformation? We know they've been doing it in our political campaigns, but also worrying reports as well that disinformation may be spread around important issues like accessing vaccines and the flu jab.
The Secretary.
My honourable friend is quite right to raise this. Cybersecurity is an extremely important issue, and fake news and the dissemination of potentially dangerous information is one part of that. So the National Cybersecurity Centre is looking very hard at this. It takes a number of measures to combat it, some of which obviously have to remain private, but I can absolutely assure him it is very high on the agenda of the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is just over a year old and which is doing very good work in ensuring that the whole area of cybersecurity is much better than it used to be.
Streeting.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. An 11-year-old primary school pupil approached me to tell me that he, his mother and his two brothers live in a single room in a bedsit in Ilford, and could I find him a council flat like the one that I grew up in? What's heartbreaking about that is that I know, and the First Secretary will know, that it's very unlikely that he will ever have one. So can I ask him very simply, given that the measures announced in last week's so-called housing budget will not solve the scale of the problem that sees more than 100,000 children living in temporary accommodation, what is he going to do to make sure that that boy, his family and every other child living in a bedsit or temporary bed and breakfast accommodation gets the decent home that they need, that they can call their own?
I absolutely agree that this is a serious problem, and that's one of the reasons why housing was at the centre of my right honourable friend, the Chancellor's budget. I hear from the opposition front bench that the right honourable lady has recovered her voice now and is asking what we're doing about it. I'll tell her what we're doing about it. Last year, we delivered more homes than we've seen in all but one of the last 30 years, 217,000, taking us to 1.1 million since 2010. Over the next 5 years, we will invest £44 billion in home building, boosting the funding for council, social and low-cost housing to over £9 billion. We are building more social housing than the Labour government did in its 13 years in office. We will build even more in the future. This is a government that's addressing his constituents' problems. Previous Labour governments signally failed to do so.
Alex Chalk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the recent extremely successful Cheltenham Literature Festival, Hillary Clinton came and talked about the importance of ensuring that the Russians are not allowed to meddle in British elections or indeed in American elections. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we should be building an offensive cyber capability so that our opponents know we have the will but also the wherewithal to strike back?
My honourable friend is exactly right, as you would expect from the Member of Parliament who represents GCHQ. And he is absolutely right about the offensive capacity that we may well need in the cyber area, and I'm happy to assure him and the House that we are indeed developing that.
Mary Black.
Yeah. I would like to ask the Minister if, without mentioning the new state pension, apprenticeships, or stating the falsehood that the Scottish Government can somehow fix the problem, and given that the Prime Minister is a waspy woman herself, how he can justify a rise of 413% in the number of women over the age of 60 in receipt of ESA because of this Government's refusal to give them their pensions?
Well, as I replied to a previous question on this subject, I hope she would recognise the principle that is right, that we need, as we live longer, to move up the pension age. And she knows as well as I do that actually the Scottish Government does have the capacity to top up welfare payments. They like to sit here and deny this, but in Holyrood they know they could do this. So, as ever with the SNP, they should stop simply moaning in this chamber. They should go back to their own government in Scotland and say if they want to do something, they should do it. They should get on with the day job of running Scotland.
Wendy Morton.
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the government's modern industrial strategy that was launched this week. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it's really going to be important as this country moves forward? We seek a global Britain in creating more and better quality jobs.
My honourable friend is exactly right. The point about the industrial strategy, which is a hugely important moment, is to create not just a stronger economy, but a fairer economy for decades to come. That's why it's looking forward to 2030. It's a long-term attempt to make sure that we have not just a global outward-looking economy, which I completely agree on, but a modern economy where we can capitalise on our huge research strengths and our huge intellectual strengths to make sure that, unlike as so often in the past, we actually benefit commercially from that for decades to come. That's the route to rising productivity and rising prosperity.
Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Sunday, the 3rd of December, is the UN International Day of Persons with a Disability. So far, this government has refused to carry out a cumulative impact assessment of its social security policies on people living with a disability. Will the First Secretary now mark this day by doing the right thing for disabled people and carry out a full cumulative impact assessment?
The Secretary.
Well, I'm sure the honourable lady, who has great expertise in this field, will know that this government is spending £90 billion on disability benefits. But more to the point, we are being more successful than ever before in giving disabled people a degree of independence. Hundreds of thousands more disabled people are in work than have ever been before. We have a plan to have an extra million in work over the next 10 years. That is an extremely important and practical way to improve the lives of hundreds of thousands of disabled people. That's what this government is doing, and that's what we'll continue to do.
Richard Bacon.
Mr. Speaker,